Hi, I'm Saskia van Nouhuis, and I'm a professor of ecology in the Center for Ecological Sciences at the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore. And the lecture that I'm giving now is part 2 of species invasions as an ecological process. So in part 1, I introduced the concept of species invasion, especially as an ecological process rather than sort of a socio-economic process. And I gave an example, and I talked about how invasive species arrive in their new habitat. So now I'm going to start off with what makes the new habitat vulnerable to being invaded. And then, okay, I'm going to talk about what makes a new habitat vulnerable to invading. Then I'm going to talk about what makes both the habitat and a species able to spread in a new environment, which is it has to do in order to be invasive. I'm going to talk about both evolution. I'm going to talk about evolution after it evolves in the new environment, which also may make it a more successful invasive species. And then I'm going to talk about ecological impacts of invasive species that we can think of above the community level, and this time on the ecosystem level. All right. Okay, so last time I showed this figure, which shows this step-by-step process of a species successfully invading. And we talked about the idea of a propagule, the set of individuals that arrive. So the next step in orange is the establishment in the new area. And one of the things that's very important for the establishment in the new area is the concept of disturbance of the receiving environment. Okay, so in general, disturbed communities are susceptible to invasion. And so these disturbances can be either natural or due to humans. And so examples of natural disturbances are a tree falling. That's a small spatial scale, but it's a disturbance. Heavy rain can disturb an area. Drought, fire, naturally occurring fire, natural disease outbreaks, the successional process in a community, landslides, hurricanes. So these are natural processes that sort of make openings that are disturbance, and they make openings in an environment for new species to potentially arrive. And also, of course, human-caused disturbances. So agriculture is a disturbance. The urban environment is a disturbance. Pollution, roads, deforestation, fire that's caused by humans. So these, there's very large and small-scale disturbances due to humans. So this is sort of what I mean by disturbances. So we can think about, okay, what about disturbances makes a habitat vulnerable or makes a community vulnerable? And I guess, and I think the way to think about that, especially as an ecologist, is that when a disturbance happens, some species are, say, missing. And so the resources those species were using become available. Or a disturbance can change what resources are available in the area, and then that would also make resources available for the organism. And in general, if an invasive species is to survive, it needs to be able to get resources. So one way to think about this is to think about that an environment, if it's not disturbed, is sort of using up all the resources that all the species there have available to it. So meaning that there isn't some extra resources just hanging around. If there were, then those species that were there already would be using that resource. And so you can make a habitat vulnerable by either adding some kind of resource to the environment, or in changing the environment so that it is not taking up as much of the resource that it used to be taking up, and so there's some resources available. And this is called the fluctuating resource availability hypothesis for making communities susceptible to invasion. So the big picture significance of this is that disturbance makes resources available to invaders. And so we see that an intact, undisturbed species, the more resources that are available, the more resources it takes up. But if you make resource available, and I'll give you some examples of that in a minute, then, which is movement from A to B in this figure, then it becomes more invasible. Or if you reduce resource uptake, so this is going down on this axis, so from A to C, then you also make it more easily invasible. Okay, now I'm going to talk about ways that disturbance causes resource pulses or resource declines, or decline in resource uptake. Okay, so here's an example of an invasion success due to disturbance. So in 1900 or so, railroads were being built in the US, in the United States, similar to the way they were also being built in India. And when the railroads were being built, there was a lot of erosion. They built up the sort of base of the railroads, and then there was sort of erosion under the railroad tracks, and then that would cause some problems. And so ice plant was brought from South Africa to plant on these verges of the railroad tracks to stop erosion. And that worked pretty well for stopping erosion. But the problem is that this ice plant became invasive, and the method that it became invasive is that ice plant is that where it grew in South Africa was an area that had very frequent natural fires, and ice plant seeds are sort of triggered by fire to germinate and grow new ice plant, and so it's a very fire adapted species. And so in California, where the plants were not so fire adapted as the ice plant, whenever there was a fire, the ice plant would grow back very quickly, and the natural chaparral that existed in that landscape would grow back more slowly. And so after a while, the ice plant outcompeted the natural chaparral, and this this has led to ice plant being all throughout coastal California. And so the disturbance in this is fire. So fire leaves space open, and the ice plant comes in very quickly and uses these resources that are made available before the native plants can do it. Okay, so in addition to disturbance, another thing that can affect the establishment of species is interaction with the species that are already there. Okay, and we can think of those interactions as either making invasion more sort of facilitating invasion happening, or we can think of it as resisting invasion happening. And I'm going to talk about both of those. Okay, so okay, so first I'm going to talk about, just to remind us, what do I mean by, so I said that biological resistance facilitation, that means biotic interactions, so biological interactions between species. And these biological interactions are competition, predation, parasitism, herbivory. So you could think of a plant being eaten by an animal or an insect, mutualism, such as pollination, these kinds of things. These are biotic interactions. Okay, and so this is an example of a sunbird. And so we could say that if a plant that's pollinated by sunbird, it can't invade into some place that doesn't have sunbird. Or a sunbird, yeah, we'll go with that. A plant, and so in this sense, there's this, without having the right biotic interaction, the invasion can't occur. Okay, so these are just some really quick examples so that you can get the general idea that these biotic interactions really are important for the success or failure of invasive species. Okay, so we're going to start with interactions that resist invasion. So competition. So one example of that are native pine trees in Argentina are at a competitive advantage over the non-native ones. So there's high propagule pressure of non-native pine trees in Argentina, but the existing ones, for various reasons, outcompete the invaders, so the invasion doesn't happen. Predation. An example of resistance due to predation is these rock crabs. So in coastal areas, these crabs are pretty good predators, and so when invasive rock crabs arrive in along the coast, the native rock crabs eat them, so they can't invade. So this occurs. Mutualism. There's lots of examples where mutualism, where sort of the lack of both players in a mutualism make it so that invasion can't happen. So I gave the example with the sunbird, but then of course there's also examples such as fig trees, which have very specific pollinators. And so fig trees can't establish in places that don't have the wasps that pollinate them. Okay, so those are some examples where biological interactions inhibit invasion. Now we're going to look at biological interactions that facilitate invasion. Okay, so competition. One example of that is some grasses that grow in the shade or sort of in the shelter of shrubs in Australia. So they're able to not compete directly with other grasses by growing in this sort of place where other grasses aren't growing. So they're sort of they're finding a place where, because the shrubs are there, the grasses are able to be there. An example of facilitation through predation is a situation that occurs in actually it's occurred various places in the world where non-native frogs are able to establish in a pond, say, because the predators of those frogs are already established there. And those predators could be native. So things that eat their predators are eaten by predators that already exist. And so then those invaders are safe to be there. And then finally, mutualism. There's various cool examples where mutualism has allowed invasion to occur. And so one example is mycorrhizae fungi. So these are fungal sort of infections of plant roots. They're extremely common. And these mycorrhizal associations help roots get nutrients and sometimes water. And so when non-native plants arrive in a new area in the soil, if the mycorrhizae that are there are able to make an association with the non-native plants, then the non-native plants have a real boost as far as nutrients and maybe water, and so that mycorrhizal association with the native mycorrhizae facilitates their invasion. Okay. So these are just a few real life examples, but there's many examples out there in the literature showing how these biological interactions within the community that species are arriving in can either help them establish or inhibit them from establishing. Okay. So that was about the receiving community. Then we want to think about the invasive species. And one thing that people have noticed is that invasion can either happen really fast, like a species arrives and then it invades. It's like, as soon as it gets there, it starts spreading. Or it can arrive and kind of be there and not be considered invasive. And then over time, you realize, wow, this has become an invasive species. Okay, so there's various processes for this to explain the amount of time it takes for species to evolve, to become invasive. So an example where species just arrive and they're just ready to be invasive right away is the prickly pear, which arrived from South America into Australia and just went crazy immediately. But then there's other times when we see this really long lag time, and we can think about reasons for that long lag time. One of the reasons that species might take longer establish is because once they get there, then they evolve, or sorry, longer to become invasive. They arrive, they establish, and they're sitting there not invasive, and then after a while they're invasive. And one of the reasons can be because while they're there, they have evolved to perform better in the environment. And some sort of clues that might be happening is this long lag time, because it takes some time to evolve. Also, another clue is if there's been a history of introductions over time, then that means that over time, more and more genetic variability has been added to the potentially invasive population. And in order for evolution to happen, there needs to be genetic variability. And so if new propagules are brought in with more genetic variability, then there's the more potential for evolution. And then another way that evolution can kind of sneak in as a way that something after a while becomes invasive is if there's hybridization. And we can think of either after a while, two invasives hybridize and then they perform well and become invasive, or after a while, a potentially invasive species hybridizes with one that's not invasive and they do well and they sort of take over, maybe even replacing the native one that it hybridizes with. Okay, here's an example of immediate invasiveness. So this is the strawberry guava, which if you go to Hawaii, grows in these super dense thickets. So you can see they're like, all these plants are strawberry guava, and they're all really tall and spindly, growing right next to each other, and there are no other plant species in this forest. So it used to be a very diverse tropical forest in Hawaii, and now it's just a thicket of strawberry guava. And these thickets can be in a really big area. And so that's how strawberry guava grows in Hawaii, where it's invasive. But if you look at that same tree in Brazil, so it's native to the sort of Amazon rainforest, then it grows as individual trees, and it's part of a diverse tropical forest. Okay, so completely different sort of life form between its native and its invasive range. So people have thought a lot, well, why does the strawberry guava do so well in Hawaii? So some facts sort of give us a good hypothesis to why it is. So if we look at Hawaii, well, first let's look at the Amazon rainforest in South America. So the Amazon rainforest has been a rainforest for at least 55 million years, and the strawberry guava has been there. And this Amazon rainforest is a very competitive environment. There's many different species. The forest is very complex, and the strawberry guava is just one little part of that. And that's been going on for millions and millions of years. Versus Hawaii, Hawaii's has come up over the last, well, 0, because it's actually still expanding, 0 to 5 million years, depending on which island you're on. So all of the Hawaiian islands are young, but especially these ones over here, which are the ones with the strawberry guava, they haven't been around very long. The forests there are made up of trees that are endemic mostly, and there hasn't been a long history of evolution there. But it has the same climate as the Amazon rainforest. So the Amazon rainforest is very old evolutionarily, and the Hawaiian Islands are very young evolutionarily, and they have the same climate. Oops. And so the hypothesis that people have about this is the reason that the strawberry guava is so invasive is because it evolved to be very competitive in the Amazon rainforest. And then when it came to this sort of new environment that had not had a long time to evolve competitiveness, it was extremely competitive against all other plants and has taken over. And so this is an example of past evolutionary history making a species primed to be invasive in a new environment. And Hawaii is an especially vulnerable environment because all of the plants in Hawaii are relatively new, thinking on evolutionary timescale. Okay. Here's another example when we're thinking about this lag time of an invasive species. So this is a picture showing many different trees and shrubs introduced into Europe between over the last few hundred years. And so this is showing years since introduction into Europe, meaning that how many years was it there before it was noticed as invasive. So we can see that sort of the most species, about 28% of the species, were present for 150 years before they became invasive. But some species became invasive within 50 years, and some species started to become invasive after they had been there for 350 years. So there's a big range in this lag. One of the reasons for there being a lag and there being a range in the lag is the sort of pre-existing life history of the plant. So some trees have very long generation times. They take many years to be mature and grow seeds, and then the new ones take a long time to grow up. And they have to be pretty big before they have a big effect on the ecosystem. And so so just having a really long generation time makes there be a lag with respect to our sense of time. Also, over time, as I just sort of hinted at before, there could be evolution. So trees may arrive there, but say their flowering time doesn't quite match the seasonal weather or the pollinators, or say they're only marginally winter hardy and they evolve more winter hardiness, meaning able to withstand frost or freezing. They evolve that over a few generations, and then they can become invasive. Another thing that happens to have happened over this period of time is the climate has changed. So maybe these plants haven't changed themselves, but the environment has just gotten a little better, and so for them, and so they become invasive due to climate change. Okay, so these are these various reasons why we might see this really long lag, and these are like really different ecological and evolutionary explanations for this process, which is quite common, of a lag. Okay, so I'm going to give an example of one of the causes for lag, which is that the species evolves to be more suited to the new environment, but that evolution only happens after several introductions, because with each introduction, more genetic variation is added, and genetic variation is necessary for evolution. So in the 1890s, again, as part of the Acclimatization Society, colonists were trying to introduce every bird that was mentioned in Shakespeare's scripts into America. So Shakespeare actually mentioned 600 different species of birds, and the people in the Acclimatization Society tried to introduce hundreds of those, but only a few of them established. So one of the species that Shakespeare spoke about was the European starling. And so the first introductions of the European starling into New York failed. And then this guy, Eugene Schieffelin, got, I guess, really preoccupied with trying to introduce the starlings. And so he reduced 60 starlings into Central Park in New York City. And then he reduced in 1890, and then he introduced 40 more a year later. And there had already been some introductions, but no spread. So there was a sizable population in Central Park of European starlings. And what people think is that those multiple introductions, which kind of stuck, introduced pretty much genetic variation of the starlings into North America. And so now, one way or another, there's 20 million, at least, starlings, and they are not just in Central Park, they're all across North America, even in the western states. And so people have said, wow, the European starlings live in a much larger range of habitats in their introduced environment in the United States than they do in their original environment in Europe. So meaning that if you go from the eastern to the western US, you cover a lot of temperature and rain sort of environments. It's much greater than the starlings experience or live in Europe. And so a recent genetic study has looked at the characterized the genetic structures of the different populations of the starlings all over North America. and they have concluded that they've evolved to live in a much broader range, in a much broader range of climates than in their native range, and that was due to evolution that was allowed because the initial population had quite a lot of genetic variability. And so what this figure is showing, and this figure is from this 2021 paper, is showing genetic clusters of starlings, which differ in their tolerance of in their tolerance of dryness and in the weather conditions that they can withstand in different states in the United States. So AZ is like for Arizona, which is very dry and very hot. There's nowhere in Europe that is as dry and hot as in Arizona, or almost nowhere. So this broad evolution can't really happen without there being genetic variability, and there can't really be genetic variability without multiple introductions. Okay. So then, anyway, so the species arrive in the new area, and there's some kind of lag time, and that lag time has ecological and evolutionary explanations. And then, bit by bit, one way or another, or maybe not bit by bit, the population increases and it spreads. And so that increase in spread is both increase in population size and dispersal. So that's what I'm talking about now. Okay. So the rate of spread of a population, just generally, has to do with population growth rate, so like the generation time, and number of babies that they have, and the dispersal distance. So if something is spreading slowly, it could be partly due to having a low population growth rate. And also it could be because its dispersal distances are short. So it doesn't have kids very often and they don't move very much. And then the rate of spread is slow. The rate of spread is fast if the population growth rate is high, and it can disperse sometimes long distances. Then it spreads quickly. So that's just general, not just invasive species, just general about things. Okay, so what are things that affect the rate of spread? So first I'm going to talk about the things that affect the rate of spread through their effect on population growth rate. So one of them is life history, as I mentioned, generation time or number of offspring. That affects population growth rate. Another thing is resource availability. So even if the population growth rate is relatively high, if the resource availability is low, then the actual population growth rate can't be high. So if resources are plentiful, the population can grow and spread faster. Also, interactions with other species. So again, in a competitive environment, it can't spread as quickly as in a less competitive environment. Predators can slow it down. Parasitism can slow it down. These things, the presence or absence of mutualisms, can affect the population growth rate. And then environmental conditions such as the weather. So the weather in the new environment may not be just right for the species, or it may actually be better than in the original environment. And then as I talked about a little while ago, the size and the genetic variability of the propagule can affect the population growth rate. Okay, and then so that was the rate of spread as it's affected by population growth rate. Now this is the rate of spread as it's affected by dispersal rate. So dispersal rate has to do with life history. So how much do they invest in moving? And also what's their behavior with respect to moving. So there's like, how far could you disperse? And then there's also, how inclined are you to disperse? The presence or absence of vectors. So humans can move organisms, or a organism might, say a parasite of a bird. It needs, if the bird is there and the bird moves a lot, then the parasite moves a lot. Mutualists can influence dispersal rate. And again, environmental conditions such as the weather or wind, things can get blown, and that sort of aids in dispersal. And then aspects of the landscape can affect dispersal. So if there's mountains between two suitable environments, it may be a very long time until it gets to the other side of the mountain or something like that. And so all of these things, both intrinsic to the organism and extrinsic to the organism, all of these things affect the rate of spread of an invasive species. So we're looking at this lag picture again. You can think of it generally as a lag. You don't have to worry about the woody plant species. So why is there the lag? The lag, in some sense, has to do with changes in the population growth rate, accumulation of facilitators. So we talked about species that facilitate invasiveness. They may come after the first invaders come there. Environmental change. It may be that a species arrives in some place and it's suitable enough that it persists there, but it's not great. But then by chance it gets to somewhere that's better, and then it sort of invades that new habitat. And so it's like arrives at even a more suitable environment secondarily. Okay. So these are sort of reasons for the lag. Originally, I was talking about the lag mostly in terms of evolution, but then there's all these ecological explanations for the lag as well. Okay. So now I'm going to talk one last example, and this example is going to be about the So I gave you an example at the beginning of the ecological impact of invasive species on a food web. And so we think of that as sort of at the community level. So all these species that are interacting, which is the forest vertebrates, that's the forest vertebrate community, and the invasive species had an effect throughout the forest vertebrate community. But now I'm expanding up, and I'm going to talk about the ecological impact of invasive species on an ecosystem. So an ecosystem involves more than just the community, but also the physical environment and the sort of energy flow within the environment. The example that I'm going to give is of the, let's see, the zebra mussel and the quagga mussel, which are two freshwater aquatic organisms that have invaded into North America, but they've also invaded into many other places in the world. And they feed on, they're filter feeders, and they feed on algae in the water. And this is a picture showing the occurrence in North America in 2001. So this is an invasion that's still going on of the zebra mussel, which is in red, and the quagga mussel, which is in green, and both mussels together, which is in yellow. And this is to say that they originated in the Great Lakes, and then they have gone through all of the rivers, like the Mississippi River, and sort of spread, and they're still spreading. Probably they'll be in all of the lakes and waterways in the eastern North America soon. Okay. So they were introduced from Europe into the Great Lakes in the 1980s in ship ballasts. So 1980s, that's not that long ago. They spread through the waterways, and they're a dominant species in many lakes. So every lake they come to, they have a big effect on that lake, and I'll show you that in a second. Okay, so zebra mussels feed on algae. So they take the algae from the water. This green stuff represents the algae, and here's some mussels. So I'm saying zebra mussels, but the quagga mussels are the same. So they eat that, and then they poop it out. They eat the algae, and then they poop out sort of nitrogenous waste, and that moves nutrients from the water column in the algae down to the bottom, right? So they're eating up in the water column, they're eating the algae, but then their waste falls down to the bottom. And then that means that the resources for the organisms who live on the bottom of the lake all of a sudden have gone way up. Right? So there's less algae in the water column, and then there's more nutrients down at the bottom. So all these organisms who feed at the bottom, we call those benthic organisms, have more food to eat. So what happens? So they digest the algae and they excrete the nutrients. So they excrete nitrogen, So free nitrogen, which was bound up in the algae, is now available, especially at the bottom. Phosphorus is available, especially at the bottom. And then carbon moves from high in the water column down to low. And so the resources that are available change, and also who the resources are available change. But that's not the only, that's a pretty profound change, but that's not the only change, because another thing that happens is, since they're feeding on all of this green algae, they feed on it and then it's not there. And so that makes the water column more clear. So there's less green algae in the water, and so the water is, sunlight can get deeper down into the lake. And that has, sunlight getting deeper down into the lake has a few different effects. One of them is it makes the, so the water clarity is much higher, and the depth of water that's warm is also much larger. And so this thing which lakes have, the thermocline, which is because the hot water rises and the cold water sinks, that thermocline goes down. And so the distribution of resources changes, and also the distribution of sort of environments for organisms to live also changes. And so plants can grow down deeper into the water, and there's a bigger area in the water which has been heated by the sun. And so this makes these very big, clear lakes with a much different biology than they had before the mussels arrived, and something that's very evident to humans, because humans go and they look at the lakes, they're a different color. The fish in them are different fish. Everything has changed. Okay. So that's the end of this two-part lecture on species invasions. And I'll just once again kind of try to give you the big picture. So species invasions are human-aided ecological process, and they have a big effect on the species where they invade. And we can look at that in terms of interactions between individual species, or we can look at that at the community level, like the snakes in Guam, or we can look at it at the ecosystem level, where the whole lake ecosystem is changed due to the mussel invasion. I talked about the process. I've talked about the invasion process as having steps, and so the steps are transport to the new environment, and then establishment in the new environment, and that establishment is due to attributes of the invader, but then also attributes of the invaded environment. There are biotic interactions that are really important for either the success or the failure of a species invasion. Then I talked about the rate of spread of an invader. And again, the rate of spread, it has to do with the growth rate of the population and also its ability to disperse. And both the growth rate and the ability to disperse have to do with the species that is invading, but also the surrounding environment. So in the same way as the biotic interactions. I talked about a characteristic lag time in species becoming invasive after their arrival. And that lag time has a lot of different sources. Some of them are evolutionary and some of them are ecological. And some of them could be due to environmental change between when the organism was introduced and it became invasive. And that's the whole part 1 and 2 of invasive species. Thank you.